Good afternoon, everyone. We'll give people a couple more minutes to file in. All right, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm John Hudak, the Director of the Office of Cannabis Policy and your moderator for today's event. On behalf of OCP, we thank you for being here for the latest installment of our office's Cannabis Conversation series. We're excited to be jumping back in today with a Cannabis Conversation on sales trends. As many of you know, today's event is taking place on the 5-year anniversary of the launch of adult use sales in Maine. We'll do a deep dive into the data in a moment, but first I want to acknowledge how far this industry has come over the last 5 years. Sales began with just 6 adult use stores open statewide for those first few weeks in October of 2020. Those licensees navigated COVID protocols and all of the other obstacles that came with opening a business during a global pandemic. Today, we have 177 adult use stores open statewide, all the way from Kittery to Grand Isle. On the medical side, we've continued to see a slight increase in the number of patients each year, and our registered caregivers and dispensaries remain widely available to meet the needs of those patients, allowing Maine's medical and adult use programs to exist in tandem. I also think it's important to take a minute to note and to thank and to celebrate the business owners, employees, consumers, patients, and a whole variety of other people across the state who have really made this possible, allowing these programs to be stood up and to continue to meet the needs of consumers and patients. Before we jump into our moderated discussion, I'd like to introduce today's presenter. Eric Miller is the Office of Cannabis Policy's Data Analytics Director. In this role, Eric oversees all of OCP's data and industry software and leads the data analytics team. Prior to joining OCP in January of this year, Eric worked for startups and in management consulting in the private sector, where he helped companies optimize their growth and monetize strategies. We're going to start off with a moderated discussion, and we'll save the last 15 minutes or so to address questions from the audience. Please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to submit questions throughout the event, and we'll come back to them at the end. So Eric, I began with a brief overview of where the adult use industry started 5 years ago compared to where we are now. But what have we seen year over year in terms of new adult use businesses getting licensed, and where in the state are they located?
Thanks, John. Again, my name is Eric Miller, Director of Data Analytics here at the OCP. First retail stores, as everyone here probably knows, given that we're at the 5-year anniversary and it is October, were recorded in October of 2020. And we started off with a total of 15 retail locations by the end of that year. You can see they were scattered across a lot of the state, really showcasing how much effort this group has made in order to bring this to market. This expanded pretty quickly. So you can see here by 2021, we had almost 5x our total number here of licensees or retail stores specifically. We continue to increase, especially in the southern part of the state in 2022. and then continually into 2023. Although, as you might have seen there, not as many popped up because we started to see really the maturation of the market continue to fill in areas where there were still some customers still looking for additional product. You can see here in 2024, it continued again to expand all the way up into 2025, where as of this year, we have a total of 177 retail locations currently registered, so adult use retail stores currently registered in the state of Maine across all 16 counties. In fact, we have at least 2 in every single county. And as I mentioned, if you look at this actually graphed over time, not just on a map, but overall, looking at these from 2020 all the way to 2025, you see we have had consistent growth in overall number of retail stores by year. It has leveled off a little bit in terms of the growth rate, that explosive growth we saw from 2020 through 2023, but that growth has still continued in the adult use market up until today. Now, when it comes to medical, we actually are seeing a little bit of a mix, a little bit more of a mixed trend here. So you can see here, we are looking at the number of locations here for our medical program. So depending on the type, whether it be caregivers or dispensaries, just looking at the high level numbers, dispensary location counts have continued to grow. Calling out, of course, that this isn't necessarily in a vacuum. We do, want to point out that a few years ago, we did start to allow more to take place and to come into the program. So the industry certainly has taken advantage of this. But we also wanted to point out that the story is not true of caregiver registered locations. So of the number of caregivers that has gone down over the same period of time to just over half of where it was in 2020.
So Eric, we talked a little bit about the distribution of stores. Now let's talk about what the stores are actually doing. What trends have we seen across the state over the last 5 years related to cannabis sales numbers and tax revenue?
Yeah, so at a very top high level, you can see here I've graphed the cumulative revenue. So for every dollar the industry ever makes, this arrow goes up and to the right. You can see here all the way on the left here at the very first transaction that we recorded on our end. You can see on October 2020, we hit our first 100 million total sales by February 2022. And from there, things really went up and to the right. You can see here the industry hit 500 million in total sales by March 2024, all the way up to over 800 million today as of September when we sort of pulled this data. So right at the end of Q3. That is of 2025, that is $222 on average per adult Mainer per year. So that's a tremendous amount of revenue. This is certainly a growing, but also a mature, increasingly more mature market. And you can see here when we look at the revenue actually broken out by per year, so rather than the cumulative graph that you saw earlier, but seeing this per year, the trends that we see is that this is a maturing market in the sense of revenue. It has started to level off a bit. So you can see here in 2020, again, that was only about a quarter of sales, really grew a lot into 21, continued to grow again in 22, 23, but between 2023 through 25, but especially 24 into 25, we're expecting to see a leveling off of total revenue. And you can see here for 25, obviously, we have not seen the end of the year yet. We put together a model using trends from previous years as well as sales so far this year for 2025 to project how much revenue we do expect by the end of the year across the entire industry, and it sits around 250 million or so in terms of our projections. Now, this is not equally distributed throughout the year. You can see here, this is the exact same data, but cut by quarter. So Q1, January through March, Q2 April through June, Q3 July through September, and Q4 October through the end of the year in December. And we can see here that in Q3, we generally speaking observe higher sales across the background of the rest of that year versus other quarters, as it were. So it's when it's warm here in Maine, I imagine it just becomes a more popular value proposition, but we are in aggregate seeing this trend across the entire state. And we actually see trends within the week as well. So you can see here, I have graphed similar to previously, but actually diving into just weekly revenue. You can see here on the x-axis per year, and then on the y-axis percent of weekly revenue. And we have the 7 days of the week graphed down as lines here. And what we observe is that Friday and Saturday, especially Friday, make up a pretty large percentage of weekly revenue. In fact, if you combine Friday and Saturday, sort of heading into the weekend and the first half of the weekend, you're looking at just over a third of weekly sales. So we definitely observe this. Not only are sales not consistent throughout the year in the sense of distribution, it's not even, but it's not even throughout the week. We see a spike towards Friday and Saturday, and then it settles into more of a background in the next 5 days.
So Eric, what you've been showing in the data, that leveling off happening, I think some people look at it and feel some sense of distress, but in reality, what you're seeing is a maturing market, right? What you're seeing is explosive growth at the outset, which you would expect from a new industry, but you can only sustain explosive growth for so long as the supply begins to catch up with demand. And now we're in a period of stasis where those sales numbers are still high. But year over year, those changes are starting to mute.
Absolutely.
But what you're talking about there is statewide sales. Can you talk a little bit more about what sales look like in different parts of the state?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm actually going to return to one of our previous maps here for a moment to illustrate sort of some of these regional trends. You can see here, I put a circle here at the very bottom of southern Maine around York, Cumberland, in the southern half of Oxford County and part of Androscoggin County. And what you can see here is that there's a very high concentration of stores here, not just in the same zip code, but distributed throughout these counties. And what we see when we dive into the data is that although these, specifically for York and Cumberland County, only make up just over a third of Maine residents, or about 38% in 2025, they actually make up almost 60% of 2024 adult use sales. So 59% is what we observed in 2024. That is a very, very strong lensing. There is a disproportionate amount of sales and locations actually in these two counties. And we can visualize this back in our map here with something called like a center. So imagine like the center of gravity when you have an object you're trying to balance, where on average is all of that weight sitting, right? So, I know in my car, I want to make sure the center of gravity is low versus other cars, our center of gravity might be high because they're carrying something. We can do the same thing here with the centers of a few different statistics here. So as I'm sure most folks on this call know, the geographic center of Maine is in Milo. You look at the population, it's just south of Augusta, right near the center of Kennebec County. But if we actually look within specifics to our own program and see the average location of retail stores and then the average location of each dollar made within the adult use program, we start to see this shift down into south and west towards York and Cumberland counties. So retail store locations on average are located significantly more southwest than the population center. And even more so than that, the average revenue center of all of the adult use sales in Maine are even further southwest of that, just over the border into Cumberland County. And what does this really mean? This means that relative to where people live in the state of Maine, we see that there is a disproportionate amount of revenue further south and further west than where those Maine adult residents actually live. And these numbers really, as a result, cannot be explained by just having the two most populous counties in the state being in the Southwest, York and Cumberland County. What we actually see is that when we divide this out, this revenue amount, you remember that $222 approximate figure across the whole state, we do the same exact calculation by county. We see some pretty stark contrasts. So I've highlighted in blue these counties closer to the New Hampshire border, York, Oxford, and Cumberland County. And these are our top three, in particular York, where average retail sales per year per adult resident is a little bit under double the $222 average for the entire state. And in fact, Oxford and Cumberland both go above that number as well, with the only other county reaching that $222 number being Knox County. So when we see that $222 number, there's a significant amount of regional variation. Southwest Maine is a very high concentrated area of adult use retail sales as opposed to the remainder of the state.
So Eric, in one of the big takeaways from what you've shown us really is that what's happening in the cannabis economy in one part of the state isn't necessarily exactly what's happening in the cannabis economy in other parts of the state. And it leads me to a question that I get a lot when I'm out in the field talking to business owners, talking to other stakeholders, et cetera, which is whether the adult use market has become saturated. Do you have some data to help answer that question?
Absolutely. And to answer this question, I think we want to align on two sort of key facts that we presented here so far first. So you can see the fact one is the number of retail sales locations have increased every year since program inception. So 2020 up to present, that curve has continued to go up. However, adult use retail revenue has been relatively stable since 23, in particular since 24. So if we're looking at number of locations continue to go up at a slower, but albeit still positive rate every single year and every single quarter, whereas revenue has largely been stable over the last fiscal year or two, then if you divide those numbers out, the student amongst you might have already done this in your head. As a result, per location revenue is actually falling on aggregate in our adult use program. So you can see here we have calculated out our average per year revenue per location. It was much lower in 2020, as you might imagine, because sales were only live for Q4. So from 21 to present, we in 2021 observed over $2 million on average per location sales, and a pretty steep drop off down to 22. But since then has been consistently falling. And in fact, we do observe that this year, we do project that this year we do expect it to fall even relative to 2024, only about a single digit percentage decrease, around 5 to 8% decrease versus 24, but we do project a decrease nonetheless. So this starts to get at the answer to the question of saturation. Well, on the whole, as a state, we do start to see average revenue per location falling. But what does this actually mean regionally? And we want to point out that this trend is not consistent across all of Maine. In fact, there is substantial regional variation, just like with the overall revenue numbers. So you can see here, we're highlighting York County on this graph of overall average per location revenue by year, broken out by county. York County, much higher than the rest of the state, as you might imagine, considering you saw that graph about showing average revenue on aggregate divided by the number of adult Mainers. York County was by far and away higher. It's much the same story on the per location basis. We are observing that York County is much higher, but since 22, it has been falling rapidly, down a little bit under a third since 2022, whereas other counties, with the exception of Kennebec County, have been relatively consistent or were consistent between 2022 and 2024. So from 22 to 24, it was York County really accounting for most, if not all, of that decrease on average in per location revenue that we saw in the previous slide here. And then 23 to 24, Kennebec County started to observe the same trends. But extrapolating this data is dangerous. This does not mean that necessarily because we observe this in 22 through 24 that we're going to say the same thing from 24 to 25. Just like Kennebec was relatively stable, maybe a slight decline from 22 to 23, but then a much steeper one from 23 to 24. And when we actually project, given again that revenue model that we put together, we actually expect York County's trend to stabilize, maybe even slightly higher, but I would think about this primarily as a more of a stabilization, considering how high that overall per location revenue is for York County to begin with. So we see that to be relatively stable, but you did hear me say between 5 and 8% or so projected will fall or so per location on average for 24 into 2025. So what counties are driving that now? It's largely three others. So again, the continuation of much the same trend in Kennebec County, but now we're starting to see, or starting to project to see, given data up until this point in the year and through our model, Cumberland and Penobscot County also beginning to fall faster than they previously were, or in some cases were stable previously. So now we're starting to see two other counties joining the mix, whereas York County, not so much. And all other remaining counties we do project to continue it to be stable on a per location revenue basis. So when we think about the original question, is the market becoming saturated? And we're using, say, revenue versus number of locations, hence per location revenue as our proxy for saturation. How much business is each location getting? In some places, there might be some circumstantial evidence to this. In other places, not so much. It really depends on where you are in the state. Now, just like with the revenue numbers, is this happening in the medical program too, you might ask? There's not a lot we can say about this, no, because we do not have track and trace in the medical program. We do not have this data. We are largely blind on a per location basis. But what we can do is say, hey, given annual state tax revenues for the medical program, so looking at overall that 5% for all but edibles, and then 5.5%, excuse me, and then that 8% for edibles. If we look at those numbers overall, compare that to that total medical registrant counts and location counts that I previously showed, we start to actually back out a relatively similar story. So you can see here I have graphed these green and red bars, and they have two different units here. So I'll sort of walk the group through this. You've got here, the green bar is referring to overall medical cannabis program tax revenue collected by the state. And the red bar is the overall number of registrant locations. So it's across caregivers and across dispensaries. And what we observe is that overall tax revenues are falling faster than the number of locations. Now, that is not a smoking gun. That is not to say that, hey, we definitely have the data to say that, because revenue is falling faster than number of locations, that per location revenue is also falling. But it is relatively strong circumstantial evidence because we don't necessarily have the data to back up that say maybe the concentration of non-edible products being purchased is skyrocketing, for example. So the real main takeaway from here is that not conclusive proof, but we have some pretty strong circumstantial evidence to suggest that much the same effect is happening in the medical program.
So, Eric, more evidence again that what's happening in one part of the state in the cannabis economy is not necessarily true of what's happening in other parts of the state. And you've talked a bit about saturation and per retail store sales and things like that. But you get up in some parts of the state and consumers encounter cannabis deserts, particularly in the adult use program, where access to a store is very different and a much further drive than it is in parts of central and southern Maine. And those forces are real, and they have economic effects. They affect consumer behavior, et cetera. One quick reminder for the group, if you do have questions, please use the Q&A functionality at the bottom of your screen and drop some questions in there. We'll get to questions at the end, toward the end of today's program. Eric, so you've talked a bit about licensing and sales and tax revenue and how that's evolved over the past 5 years. But let's turn more to consumer behavior and consumer sentiment. What trends are we seeing related to consumer preferences, and what's being purchased in the adult use market?
Yeah, we could definitely go through that, and actually want to kick this part off with a poll for the audience here. So our staff will launch this out here. It should be up on your screen. We want to see what folks think here. In 2025, what do folks think were Maine's top 3 adult use product categories by total sales revenue? So again, this is not by numbers. This is by total revenue, dollars collected by the industry. We're going to give about a minute here or so, maybe 45 seconds here. So I'm starting to see it come up. Ooh, got 3 neck and neck here. This is a tight one. All right, about 20 more seconds. It's starting out to be a tight one. All right, about 5 more seconds and we'll lock it in. And all right, so looks like given the audience, you've selected vape products number 1, raw pre-rolls number 2, and buds flower number 3. So I want to point out, actually, this is not far off. So when we think about the top 3, folks have certainly picked the right top 3. We have in 2025, buds flower, raw pre-rolls, and vape products make up the number 1, 2, and 3 product categories respectively, but it actually is flipped in the direction that folks voted, which I think is pretty interesting. You can see here, buds flower by total revenue has been flat all throughout the entire program, right at the top. So consistently, the number 1 revenue getter within the state on aggregate across the whole industry is buds flower. However, raw pre-rolls, since really not even being a factor in 2020, and all the way down in 4th place in 2021, has exploded across the market since being introduced. It is now at the number 2 spot, followed by vape products, which has also been consistently pretty strong. Being supplanted by these 3 strong contenders over time, edibles have fallen to the 4th position, concentrate in the 5th position, and we say each here because we're referring to individual concentrate-based products, not referring to buying concentrate in bulk by the number of grams. And then at the 6th and 7th positions here, infused pre-rolls and drinks. Now, you can see here when these bars have dropped off, that's essentially what that's saying is that in previous years, it wasn't even in the top 7. It was outside that top 7. So we felt this is pretty interesting. Like top of mind here is it sounds like this industry has a very strong pulse on much the same trends. Now, why, you might ask, do we pick 7? Well, the reason why we picked 7 is because if you looked at those 7 only, they make up 97%, 95 to 98%, depending on the year, of overall revenue across the whole state, across all product types. So there's tons of different product types. These are the top 7. They make up almost all sales. So you can see here, this is a proportion of each year's sales that this product category makes up. And we have it marked down here on the bottom, and then other is in black. So percentage of total revenue. We see here, I have this at the header here, that Bud's Flower's margin of victory has actually been steadily declining, all the way from just under 50% in 21 and actually over 50% in the sort of final quarter of 2020, down to just over a third of overall revenue in 2025. Whereas the others here are either expanding or flat here, is a proportion. So it's actually been Bud's Flower that's been decreasing. But behind this is more of a nuanced trend. We don't want to just say that, hey, Bud's Flower is decreasing, all the other ones are absorbing it, right? We can go a little bit, we can try a little bit harder than that. So if we look at the overall proportions just for flower-based products, and I know infused pre-rolls is sort of a standout here because there is some additional product in there that's not flower, but we're really looking at sort of like as a baseline, a flower-based product here. We see that overall, pre-rolls in general, but especially raw pre-rolls over time have been the ones taking over Bud's Flower's market share. So pre-rolls really not a big factor in 21 to 25. It's actually pretty close to 60-40, 60 Bud's Flower, 40 raw pre-rolls. But that overall proportion that is a sort of flower-based product is flat every single year from 21 through 2025. Again, sort of leaving 2020 out a little bit here just because it was just the final quarter and the program was really just starting. So you can see here, infused pre-rolls have grown significantly, although from a much smaller starting place, but raw pre-rolls have grown almost double in terms of overall sales revenue over that time frame. So this starts to contextualize why you saw in 2021, raw pre-rolls are number 4, but now they're number 2. Across the other two major sort of product category types, so this one being sort of concentrate-based products, although the proportions can change a little bit, these are also super consistent. So the proportion of the market that's buying a concentrate-based product is pretty flat. And same thing goes for edible products. So we're breaking out here edibles in terms of solids and then drinks. While the proportion might change a little bit and it might sort of overlap one of these dotted lines a little bit more one year versus another, on the whole, we are observing that these three sort of groupings of how consumption happens is pretty consistent. So consumers prefer the same form of consumption, be it a flower product, a concentrate or a concentrate only product, or a edible product, be it drinkable or chewable or crunchable. Since 2021, consumers have their form of consumption, they stick to it, they like it, but they are changing around how they're doing it. So a pre-roll versus flower versus an infused pre-roll, or say different types of concentrate products, or maybe they're used to eating gummies and maybe they're going to try out a drink, for example. So we're seeing more so that method of consumption within that type of product, that form of consumption being pretty consistent.
Right, Eric, I'm playing some catch up as I'm trying to do the sort of admin side of this. I will remind people, thanks for sending some questions in so far. But again, use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen and we'll get to those probably in about 15 minutes or so. You know, as I go around the state talking to business owners, Eric, one of the things that I ask them is like, what's popular? What are you selling a lot of? What's increasing in popularity, et cetera? And those numbers really line up. You know, one of the answers I almost always get is, first off, flower is king. Like I hear that from almost every business owner. What I'm hearing from a lot of people is the quality of pre-rolls is really increasing and the ease of those have real appeal within the market. And then for some other products, you know, vaping is more popular among consumers under 30. And so that's hitting that part of the market really well. Edibles and drinkables are more popular with sometimes the older crowd. I hear from a lot of business owners, particularly women over 50. There's a lot of appeal to that. The discretion of the products, not smoking them, et cetera, has real appeal. And so those really line up from what I'm hearing around the state for sure. Next question for you, Eric. How have average receipt amounts and product prices been shifting in the adult use market? Are there any notable purchasing behavior trends based on, say, transactions?
Yeah, so I love this question because it really gets into not just what folks are buying, but what are the trends on a per customer basis. So when we think about receipt here, as you might imagine, given in our data, we don't have information on, say, like demographics, psychographics, things like that. We can't say what kind of person each purchase was. But what we can do is start to map out a little bit of for a given receipt that someone pays, what they are buying, how much, etc. So what we did is we did an analysis here on the average revenue from a customer receipt. And what I mean by receipt is you go up to the counter, you put your products on the counter, you pay for it, and you walk away with a baggie. And that receipt that you get is what the term receipt that we're using here. This isn't necessarily like as a standalone sales term. We're really using this very colloquially. So when you look at each one of these receipts here, on average, how much are folks spending? And over time since 21, this number has been in decline. So a little bit over $70 per receipt on average across the whole industry in 21. Again, sort of leaving 2020 a little bit out here because it was a little bit weird, a little bit different being just that Q4 launch, but still want to include it here for the context. Down each year, falling at a lower rate each year, but still falling into 25. Or so far this year, we are seeing a average of about $50 to $53 depending. So we see that this number has fallen pretty consistently throughout. Each year's decrease has been a little bit different, but the fact that it is falling each year has been pretty consistent since 21. But we want to layer another piece of data on here because this doesn't tell the whole story. If we look at receipts, but now not revenue, but on actual number of products purchased. So how many on the receipt, how many items did you buy? That number has been pretty consistent since 21. You can see here it's hovered just below 2 pretty much the entire duration of the program since 21. And again, when we see this isn't necessarily referring to you can't have 1.9 items obviously on a receipt. This is referring to an average. So in some cases, someone might buy 1. A lot of cases, someone might buy 2. In some cases, someone might buy significantly more than 2 products. So we're seeing here that average per receipt revenue is in decline, but the number of products they're actually purchasing is relatively flat. So we're spending, essentially, folks are spending less per, not that they're spending less per item, but they're buying fewer items. And in fact, when we look at this per product category, so I have a list of 4 of the 7 here, we actually see that each time that product is purchased, so imagine each one of these, when that product shows up on the receipts, each time it's purchased, we actually see that average revenue is going up or is relatively flat. So you can see here, edibles, you can barely see it at the bottom here because it's so consistent. From 22 through 25, the percent change in per customer sales for edibles has been super stable since 2022. And for other products here, it's actually nudged up a little bit for vape products and for concentrate products and has really gone through the roof on drinks. In fact, folks in 2025, on average, when they buy a drink, they're spending 60% more on drinks than in 2022, which is a pretty big shift up. So what gives? If the average number of products purchased per receipt is stable, but the average amount of revenue that's being collected on each one of those receipts is in decline, and I imagine a lot of folks out here know exactly where I'm going here. What's causing this? Flower-based products. So average price per gram of flower is down significantly since 2022. Probably news to absolutely no one here. 923 per gram that we observed on average in 2022 has fallen now to 2025 so far this year, an average of $6.74 per gram. And in fact, that doesn't even tell the whole story because we're observing a continued downtrend throughout the year. So in the beginning of the year, we averaged above 674 per gram, and now we're averaging closer to 650, 655. So this number has consistently continued to go down. And I want to call out one more thing here, in that this isn't strain specific, this isn't region specific, this is across the entire state. So when we look at our average purchase weight for when across the whole state that flower is purchased, it's going up, in fact, because even though that average purchase volume is pretty flat, that amount of price decrease is so significant that folks, despite actually purchasing more flower on average per transaction, so when we say transaction, I'm talking about that product purchased. When someone buys flower, how many grams are they buying? You can see here Bud's flower has continued to go up from 2020 at about 3 grams, and now in 2025 over 5 grams on average. And raw pre-rolls from 1 gram to significantly above 1 gram, a little bit over 1.5 grams. What we actually see is that even though that number is going up because prices have fallen so much, we actually see that when we look at this at the per product purchased amount in terms of revenue, not in terms of number of grams purchased, it's down. So since 22, you can see here pre-rolls has leveled out by about 6 to 7% less revenue per product purchased on a receipt, whereas for buds and flower, it's actually fallen every single year. It is now more around an eighth lower, or 12.5% or so lower in 25 than it was in 2022, despite folks getting like 60% more flower. So, and this is the number 1 and number 2 product categories for the entire state. So when we show this data, this is a really big effect, and ultimately why we're seeing a falling per receipt amount.
All right. Well, thanks for that presentation, Eric, and the data for everyone's awareness. After the cannabis conversation is over, within a day or two, we'll have this recording posted up on the OCP website. I know Eric threw at you a lot of data packed into a pretty quick 40 minutes. And so I'm sure for a lot of people, there's a lot to digest. There's a lot to think about, whether it's in terms of distribution of stores, the types of products that are more popular, the trends in products, et cetera. So that information, like I said, will be available on our website. We're going to transition into the Q&A section. But a reminder, while we wind down our final 15 minutes in Q&A, I encourage you to continue to ask some questions. If there are some that we can't get to by the time we wrap, we can always follow up with individuals afterwards. But we've had a large number of questions, and sorry, I'm working off 2 screens here, about the impact of hemp products, and particularly the impact of hemp products on beverage sales. And so, Eric presented some data that shows sort of a mixed information about drinks, right? So drink sales are increasing in themselves year over year, but they still occupy a pretty small percentage of overall product sales in the state. And so the question, we got questions from Natasha and from Sean and from several others about what the impact of hemp would be, including one request for whether we had data on hemp sales. And so I'll start from the beginning. OCP does not have regulatory authority over hemp or hemp products, and so we don't have data to collect. Hemp is not tracked in the way that adult use cannabis is, and so the regulatory agencies that oversee hemp, namely the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry in the state, also don't have access to that type of information. For those of you who've heard me talk about the hemp issue in the past, you've probably heard me say this line, but an unregulated, untaxed, and untracked hemp market in the state of Maine is an existential threat for our state's medical and adult use cannabis programs. And so I would be shocked if there is not some impact by these hemp products on the programs that OCP does regulate. And we've heard a lot from individuals. Sorry, I'm not trying to be spooky for Halloween on this. My light's on a timer. The We've heard a lot from business owners around the state about their concerns about hemp, and those of you who are concerned, continue to reach out to our office with those concerns. We've heard from some people that they've gone out and purchased hemp products or products that are labeled as hemp products, and they've sent it off for testing, and a lot of it's not hemp. A lot of it has contamination in it. There are deep concerns about not just issues around regulatory authority, but issues around the contamination and the safety of these products, and those public health concerns are real. They're ones that our office is listening to and the administration is listening to, and we're working on that issue right now. But like I said, I think it would be foolish to suggest that a market like that is not competing. We hear from business owners that competition is real, and that stores that are selling hemp products near stores that are selling, let's say, adult use cannabis products are feeling that burn from it. And especially with interstate commerce in hemp or so-called hemp products, it makes it an even bigger burden for the industries that we regulate. And so, like I said, I encourage you to reach out to us with those concerns and your experiences with them. I also encourage you to reach out to your elected officials. As I said, OCP doesn't have regulatory authority over hemp or hemp products. We also can't just grab that regulatory authority, and we can't just go ahead and do something about it without legislative authority to do so. And so if you see hemp as a problem in the state, or if you don't see hemp as a problem in the state, definitely communicate with your elected officials about, like I said, what that experience is. And most importantly, I think what it means for your business. I can talk to legislators all day long about what we're seeing, but the bigger impact, especially with elected officials, both at the state and the federal level, is when a business owner talks to people in elected office about what's happening inside their business, what it means for the people they employ, what it means for their community. Those are really impactful kinds of conversations to have. And like I said, I encourage you all to have those conversations. The next question comes in from Dr. Patty Hymanson. Let me just pull it up quickly. For some reason, it's disappeared on me. She asked about what happened to the caregivers. Did they migrate to the adult use program, or did they drop out between 20 and 25? And Eric had put up some numbers that showed the decrease in that. So a few things we know have happened just from a licensing perspective. There have been some medical operators who have transitioned over to the adult use program. We have also had a number of caregivers who have transitioned into having dispensaries. And so while those two, we'll say business transitions, licensing transitions, does not account for the entirety of the drop in the number of caregivers, it does account for some portion of that. And like I said, we know that based on who is giving up certain license types or who's applying for certain license types, et cetera. But it has been a question that we've been asked a lot. We've been asked about it by the legislature. We've been asked by businesses and industry stakeholders about what's happening with caregivers. So a couple of years ago, we put into the field a survey asking caregivers why they exited. And we heard things like energy costs, a difficulty establishing wholesale relationships, the decreasing price of cannabis in the medical program was driving people out of the program. And Lexi is going to drop into the chat at some point a link to our caregiver exit survey, so you can read through and see in people's own words there. Lexi dropped it in. What their experience has been in terms of why they're exiting the program. Okay, next set of questions. Sorry, like I said, I'm bouncing between two screens. Eric, a question for you. And I don't know if you can tell from the data or if you have some ideas about why this might be the case, but an anonymous attendee asked, why are 2025 Q3 sales down in rec when compared to Q3 sales in 2024? And just to clarify, I know that some businesses go in and they make adjustments based on sales. Do you anticipate that all of the Q3 numbers are completely up to date, or will there be some corrections in the coming month or so about Q3 sales?
Yeah, good question. So I think this is sort of two things behind this, and I'm actually going to flash up a slide here because I think the slide again here to make sure that we are I can sort of reference the graph directly. But I think there's sort of two things to point out here. One of those is that when this data was pulled, it wasn't quite right at the end of Q3. There were a few days. So I believe it was on the September the 26th or so. As a result, there is a very, very slight effect that can come out of that, maybe slightly lower. I think that's one part of it. There's another part of it, though, that I wanted to point out here, which is that we're actually seeing, and this is, I want to preface that this is a very much a sort of initial early days sort of observation because we do not have the Q4 data to back this up yet. But we're actually seeing, for example, that Q1 numbers are up relative to 2024, and Q2 numbers are relatively flat. Q3 is a little bit down. We might be seeing, and this is something we really want to dig into in January, once we have the Q4 numbers, we might be seeing the beginnings of a leveling off of the seasonal trend. So you can see here, maybe Q3 still at the top, but maybe not as pronounced as in previous years. So while this may not be a direct answer, this is a sort of initial view into what might be a changing trend. Again, extrapolation is really the enemy of understanding here. We want to get to that data at the end of Q4. And I apologize, John, the remainder of that question around, reconciliation. So is this because of previous years in which sales or previous quarters in which sales were recorded? So essentially this question is sort of a moot point for our data, just because the way that we pull this is on sale date rather than by when it was logged in the system. So if it was sold on, say, May 13th, that means that it will continue to be sold on May 13th in perpetuity. If it were to be returned, it would be in a separate field in that day of sale.
Thanks for that, Eric. We've gotten another set of questions that have come in asking about tourism and what the impact of tourism is on sales. And Eric, I'm going to give a quick answer, but if there's anything that you can glean from your data, I'll kick it over to you. First off, we don't track consumer information at OCP. We know what's being sold, we know how much is being sold, but thankfully, we don't know to whom it is being sold, and that's not information we want to collect either. Now, stores probably do. You have different types of rewards programs that I know stores put into place, and stores are scanning IDs, obviously, et cetera. And stores may collect that information. If they do, we don't have access to it. And so I can't tell you specifically that, yes, we have 1% of sales are coming from residents of other states in New England or something along those lines. But Eric, in terms of what you can see from some of the seasonal data, is there anything you can glean from it?
Yeah, a couple things there. One of them is that we look at seasonality for especially the counties that are higher or towards in terms of per location revenue towards the southern part of the state, so Cumberland, Oxford, and York County especially. There are sort of two different ways we can look at this. So one of them is seasonality. To your point, is this because are we seeing a higher amount of sales in the summer or in the fall versus, say, for example, the winter or the spring? Within counties, this this effect is actually relatively consistent. We see maybe slightly higher in the South, but it wouldn't be something we'd call significant. What we are seeing actually in the South is, this isn't actually specific to the South, but this is in general. We are seeing that in areas where, say, like there are a lot of stores per zip code. This isn't necessarily just related to tourism, but when you see a lot of we have a lot of stores in a given zip code, we're not actually seeing that that's necessarily resulting in a significant, say, drop in per store revenue. In other words, that's not a driver of saturation. So how does this apply to the question of what about tourism? Well, we can't derive directly that, you know, we one sale is tourism versus another in these areas in the south of the state where a lot of stores are really concentrated. We're not seeing higher rates of concentration necessarily resulting in lower store counts on a per zip code basis. So the takeaway from this when it comes to tourism is, well, actually, I wouldn't necessarily say those sales are necessarily as tied to population density as we might think. Maybe there's additional customers moving in and out of the region that might point to those additional sales. So again, this is not a smoking gun. This is not something we can definitively say it's tourism, but the takeaway here is it's possible.
Thanks for that, Eric. And I'll chime in with one other item. I mean, this is a presentation about data, and I do like sticking to data and not as much anecdote. But having talked to a lot of business owners in different parts of the state, if you have a cannabis retail store near ski resorts or on the way to ski resorts, those places will tell you that the winter is a great time for them. When you talk to businesses in the greater Portland area, the mid-coast region, they will tell you that summer is a great time for them. And so back to the point that I made earlier and that Eric's data show, what's happening in one part of the state might not impact another part of the state in the same way. And so, depending on where you are, you might hear that tourism matters a lot. In fact, I was up north a few weeks ago talking to some business owners up there. And they were lamenting what I think a lot of Maine businesses are lamenting about right now, and that is a loss of Canadian tourists this season. It's hit hotels, it's hit restaurants, it's hit bars, and it's hitting retail stores. And not that you have Canadian tourists coming into the county and purchasing cannabis and going home with it, but Canadian tourists who are here for a week and they want to purchase while they're here and consume while they're here. Those businesses along the border are really feeling that pain this year. And, like I said, it's something that's hitting all sectors of Maine's tourism economy, but that it's impacting cannabis stores near the border also tells you then that cannabis is also part of Maine's tourism economy. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir about that with this group, but it is real. And then connected to this, we've gotten a few questions about the impact of New Hampshire consumers. And I'll preface this by saying you're not supposed to purchase in one state and cross the border into another state. But we'd be Pollyannish to believe that New Hampshire consumers are not crossing the border and purchasing. I think Eric's numbers show us that when you have York and Cumberland County punching way above their weight in terms of the size of the population there relative to what the sales are. Correct me if I'm wrong, Eric. I think it was 38% of the population is there, and they account for 59% of the sales in those two counties. Those are border counties too, and that's not by accident. And so, I'm certain that in the same way that I'm sure a lot of Mainers cross the border to buy cheaper liquor, there are New Hampshireites, I think that's what they're called, New Hampshireites crossing the border and purchasing cannabis in an adult use or a medical market that they prefer in Maine. And so, there was one other question that asked if we were an export state. Again, we don't collect data on where consumers are from. I don't think we're an export state right now. I think New Hampshire is having an impact in York and Cumberland County, but it's not, the major driver of Maine's cannabis economy. Mainers are and tourists who are visiting the state really are. So we're just at about time. And so one thing I do want to let you guys know, we're going to put a feedback poll up in a moment just to hear your thoughts about how today's event went. A reminder that this will be up on our website in the next couple of days. And, for viewing, pass it around for people who wanted to tune in and couldn't for whatever reason, or if you want to go back to it, or you want to go back to some of the data that Eric presented, it will all be up online. A huge thank you to Eric Miller, our presenter, our data director here at OCP. Thanks to all of you for taking time out of your day to listen in. Once again, a huge congratulations to our adult use program on celebrating their 5-year anniversary today. And as always, please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions in the future. Be sure to visit our OCP website to access our data dashboards for each program, along with other resources. And with that, thank you all, and thank you, Eric.
Thank you, everyone.
And once again, remember to take the poll.